The campus cafe bustled with life, full of chatter, clinking mugs, and the faint aroma of espresso. Jungkook sat by the window, half-heartedly reading a book, when he noticed someone struggling near the counter. YN, holding a towering stack of textbooks with one hand while frantically searching her purse with the other, looked one wobble away from disaster. Amused, Jungkook closed his book, stood up, and walked over, unable to resist offering help. "Need a hand?" he asked, a friendly grin on his face as he steadied the stack of books in her arms. YN looked up, caught off guard, but her expression softened into a bright, slightly embarrassed smile. "Oh, thank you. I didn't realize how much I was overestimating my balance skills here," she chuckled, letting him take the books. "Honestly, this stack might be taller than me." He laughed, raising an eyebrow as he balanced the books effortlessly. "Well, no offense, but it's a pretty close match," he teased, glancing down at her with a playful glint in his eye. She laughed, rolling her eyes. "You're not wrong," she admitted. "I think I was just so eager to get everything done today that I overdid it." As they waited for her coffee, Jungkook introduced himself. "I'm Jungkook, by the way. Always happy to help fellow caffeine-dependent scholars," he said with a smile. "YN," she replied, shaking his hand with a firm but warm grip. "Nice to meet you, Jungkook, and thanks for rescuing me from my tragic book avalanche. I don't think I could have managed a graceful recovery if those had gone down." "Oh, don't worry, I'm sure it would have been a very graceful disaster," he teased, earning a laugh from her that caught the attention of a few other patrons. "So, are you always this ambitious with your reading list?" he asked, nodding toward the books now resting on the counter. Titles about philosophy, classic literature, and psychology peeked out from the pile. YN sighed, glancing at her books like they were both her best friends and her worst enemies. "Ambitious, maybe, but mostly just wildly overcommitted. My schedule is like an endless relay race, with books instead of batons," she said, grinning. He chuckled, enjoying her dry humor. "Sounds intense. Do you ever have time to do anything else?" "Oh, sure, I make time for the essentials," she said with a playful shrug. "Like more coffee, and the occasional Netflix binge when I'm feeling rebellious." Their coffees arrived, and as she reached for her cup, she looked at him curiously. "So, what about you, Jungkook? Are you one of those people who actually has their life together?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Far from it, I'm more of barely holding it together with coffee and luck type," he replied, his tone light but relatable. She smiled, clearly comforted by his answer. "Well, it's nice to know I'm not the only one," she said, lifting her coffee in a small toast. "Here's to managing chaotic schedules and avoiding book avalanches." "Cheers to that," he agreed, clinking his cup with hers. "And to meet interesting people in the middle of all the chaos." They both sipped their coffee, the moment stretching just long enough for him to notice the softness in her gaze, her genuine laugh. It felt surprisingly comfortable, like meeting an old friend for the first time. As they exchanged goodbyes, Jungkook found himself lingering, watching her leave and hoping their paths would cross again. YN's phone buzzed just as she finished setting up her living room for the movie night she'd been planning all week with Taehyung. She looked around, feeling a small thrill at how cozy everything looked. Soft blankets were draped across the couch, a bowl of buttery popcorn sat in the center, and the lights were dim to set the perfect ambiance. Their favorite movies were lined up and ready to go. Smiling, she picked up her phone, expecting a message saying he'd be there soon. Instead, her face fell as she read the text. "Taehyung, hey, can't make it tonight. The guys wanted to go out, and I thought it'd be good to catch up with them. Rain check." Her thumb hovered over the screen as she reread the message, the excitement draining from her in seconds. She took a deep breath, telling herself that maybe it was just a one-time thing. Trying to hide the hurt that was welling up, she typed back as casually as she could. "YN, I see. Well, maybe next time." She set the phone down and glanced around the room, suddenly feeling the silence weigh heavy on her. The movie she'd saved for them started playing, and she tried to focus on it, hoping to lose herself in the storyline. But as scene after scene went by, she couldn't help but imagine him sitting beside her, laughing at the jokes he'd usually find hilarious, reaching over for popcorn, maybe teasing her about her predictable love for cheesy rom-coms. Every time she laughed or reacted, there was that empty space next to her, a reminder that, once again, he'd chosen something else over spending time with her. She tried to shrug it off, telling herself he deserved to catch up with his friends, but the ache of disappointment settled in deeper. How many times has this happened? How many times had she rearranged her plans to fit his, only to end up alone? Her phone buzzed again, and for a brief moment, her heart lifted, hoping he'd changed his mind. But it was just a social media notification. She sighed, the disappointment weighing heavier. Reaching for her popcorn, she put on a brave face and watched the rest of the movie by herself, laughing at the scenes they should have shared together. Later, she tried to shake off the sadness by cleaning up, but even putting the blankets away felt like a reminder of what could have been, a small plan that was only meaningful to her. She checked her phone one last time, but there was no follow-up message from Taehyung. Not even an apology for missing their night together. With a bitter smile, she muttered softly to herself, "Guess I'll just be the only one who cares about this, then." She went to bed that night feeling colder than usual, a nagging thought echoing in her mind that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't worth his time. The library was nearly deserted that evening, cloaked in a quiet only interrupted by the occasional hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustling of pages turning. YN sat at a corner table, hunched over her notes, though her focus was far from her studies. She kept tracing and retracing the same line on her paper, her thoughts drifting to Taehyung, to the disappointment she tried so hard to bury. Despite her best efforts to study, her mind was clouded with the ache of feeling unimportant to someone she loved so deeply. Lost in her thoughts, she didn't notice Jungkook until he gently slid into the seat across from her, a look of concern etched across his face. He leaned forward, peering at her with that quiet attentiveness she'd come to appreciate. "YN?" he asked softly, his voice gentle, almost like he didn't want to startle her. "Are you okay?" Surprised, she looked up and forced a small, weary smile. "Oh, hey, Jungkook. Yeah, just, a lot on my mind, I guess." He didn't push her to say more, simply waited patiently, his steady gaze encouraging her to open up if she wanted. She looked back down, the weight of her worries pressing heavily on her, and before she knew it, the words started spilling out. It's Taehyung," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He cancelled on me again last night. I'd set up everything, popcorn, blankets, movies. I thought we'd have a nice night together, you know." Her voice broke slightly as she continued, "But he didn't even bother to call until I texted him. Just, something came up," he said. "It's like I'm always his last priority." Jungkook's jaw tightened, and she could see a flicker of frustration in his eyes. He took a breath, visibly trying to temper his emotions before responding. "YN, that's not fair to you. You're putting in so much effort, and he's just not showing up. If he really cared, he'd make the time." She shrugged, her fingers tracing patterns on the edge of her notebook, unable to meet his gaze. "I keep telling myself that he'll change. That maybe I just need to be more understanding, more patient. But sometimes," she paused, her voice trembling, "sometimes I feel like I'm the only one holding on to this relationship." Jungkook reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. His thumb brushed over her knuckles in small, soothing circles, a silent promise of comfort. "YN, maybe you're being patient with the wrong person," he murmured, his voice laced with a softness that made her heart ache. "Love shouldn't feel like this. You shouldn't feel like you're waiting around, hoping for scraps of attention." She looked down at their hands, feeling warmth spread from his touch. His words hit her with a truth she'd been avoiding for too long. But still, she felt the urge to defend Taehyung, even as her heart told her otherwise. "I know he cares, in his own way. He has a lot on his plate. I keep thinking maybe I'm asking for too much." Jungkook shook his head gently, his gaze unwavering. "You're not asking for too much, YN. You're asking for the bare minimum, time, effort, a sign that he wants to be there for you. And if he can't give you that, then," he trailed off, his eyes searching hers, as if willing to see her own worth. "Then maybe he doesn't deserve what you're giving him," he said. YN's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, trying to hold on to her composure. It hurts, Jungkook. I keep trying to tell myself it'll get better, that he'll start to see me, but..." She looked up at him, and in that moment, the sadness and vulnerability she'd been hiding spilled over. Her shoulders slumped, the weight of it all finally too much to carry alone. Jungkook's hand tightened around hers, grounding her, pulling her out of her spiraling thoughts. "You don't have to pretend with me, YN, he said softly, his voice a gentle anchor. "If you're hurting, it's okay to let it out. I'm here." A tear escaped, and she quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. I feel so stupid." Like, why am I waiting around for someone who keeps showing me he doesn't care? Jungkook's voice was steady, but there was a fierceness to it, a protective edge she hadn't heard before. You're not stupid. You're hoping for the best because you have a good heart. But he's taking advantage of that, whether he means to or not. And you deserve someone who sees you, YN. Someone who would never make you feel like you're alone. Her gaze softened, and for the first time that evening, she felt a small glimmer of relief. Thank you, Jungkook, she whispered, squeezing his hand back. I don't know what I'd do without you. He smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes that mirrored her own. You'll never have to find out, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not going anywhere. They sat there in the quiet of the library, the world around them fading away as she let herself lean into his warmth, into the comfort he offered without question. The ache in her chest began to ease, replaced by a steady reassurance, one she hadn't felt in a long time. YN had spent most of the day working up the courage to do this, to surprise Taehyung. She'd bought his favorite pastry from the little bakery he loved, feeling her nerves buzz with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Maybe today, she thought, would be different. Maybe he'd see her, really see her, and she could bring back the warmth they used to share. As she stepped into the cafe, the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee wrapped around her. She scanned the room, her eyes searching for him. When she spotted him, her face lit up with a smile that quickly faded as her eyes took in the scene before her. Taehyung was sitting in a booth near the window, leaning in close to a girl she didn't recognize. His face was animated, his eyes crinkled with laughter, and his hand rested casually on the table, just a few inches from hers. They looked comfortable, familiar in a way that sent a sharp pain through her chest. YN took a shaky breath, gripping the bag with his pastry a little tighter. Maybe it's just a friend, she tried to tell herself, her mind grasping for excuses. Maybe she's someone he's helping with a project, or maybe it's just a casual hangout. But the way he looked at this girl, the way his eyes lingered as he laughed, as if he had all the time in the world to just be with her, it wasn't the way he'd looked at YN in a long time. In that instant, it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. The questions she'd been burying, the doubts she'd tried to silence, all rose to the surface in a wave of hurt and anger. Unable to watch any longer, YN turned on her heel and rushed out of the cafe, her vision blurring with tears. She barely noticed the bustling city around her as she walked down the street, her mind replaying the scene over and over. Her chest felt tight, and the world seemed painfully bright, too real. Should I confront him? She wondered, her mind racing. Should I ask him why he's laughing with someone else like that, why he can't seem to look at me that way anymore? But the hurt was too fresh, too raw. The thought of hearing some excuse, of being told it was nothing, or that she was overreacting, made her stomach twist. She couldn't bear to see him brush her off, to watch him dismiss her pain with a careless smile. By the time she got home, her energy was completely drained. She dropped the pastry bag on her kitchen counter, unopened and forgotten. She climbed into bed, pulling the covers around herself as if they could shield her from the ache in her chest. She stared at the ceiling, the quiet of her room amplifying the emptiness she felt. Hours passed as she lay there, the glow of her phone on the nightstand tempting her. Part of her wanted to text him, to demand an explanation, to hear something that would make this all make sense. But a deeper part of her feared what she might hear. She'd given him so many chances already, so much forgiveness without question. How much longer could she keep waiting, hoping he'd choose her? Her phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the silence. It was a message from Jungkook. Hey, just checking in. Everything okay? The kindness in his simple words brought fresh tears to her eyes. She thought about brushing him off, pretending everything was fine, but the loneliness weighed too heavily on her. She texted back, fingers trembling as she typed. No, not really, just, had a tough day. Within seconds, her phone buzzed again. Want me to come over? Or we can talk on the phone. Whatever you need. YN hesitated, a part of her not wanting to burden him with her problems. But she knew Jungkook, knew that he'd be there for her no matter what. Taking a deep breath, she replied, could you come over? It wasn't long before she heard a knock on her door. When she opened it, Jungkook was standing there, a concerned look in his eyes. He took one look at her tear-streaked face and pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. YN, what happened? He asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper. She pulled back, wiping her eyes as she tried to steady her voice. I went to surprise Taehyung today. Thought it'd be nice to see him without any plans, just to, show up and spend time with him. Her voice cracked as she continued, but, I saw him with someone else. And they were laughing and looking at each other in a way he hasn't looked at me in a long time. Jungkook's expression darkened, a flash of anger mixed with sadness in his eyes. I'm so sorry. That's not something you deserve to go through. She shook her head, her voice trembling. I feel so stupid, Jungkook. I keep giving him the benefit of the doubt, hoping that things will change, but it feels like I'm always the one left waiting. Her voice broke as she added, I just don't know why I keep holding on. Jungkook took her hands in his gaze steady and filled with compassion. You're not stupid. You have a big heart, and you keep hoping because you believe in love. But, love shouldn't make you feel like this. You shouldn't have to wait around for someone to treat you like you matter. A fresh wave of tears welled up in her eyes, but this time, they were less from pain and more from the comfort he offered. Jungkook's words, simple and sincere, began to chip away at the self-doubt she'd been carrying. Thank you, she whispered, looking into his eyes, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in so long. I don't know what I'd do without you. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, his thumb brushing gently over her hand. You don't have to face this alone. I'm here, always. They sat together in the quiet of her living room, Jungkook's presence a steady anchor in the storm of emotions that had overwhelmed her. For the first time that day, she felt her heart begin to lighten, the weight of her pain lessened by the understanding and friendship he offered so selflessly. Over the following weeks, Jungkook became YN's quiet anchor. He seemed to know exactly when she needed a friend, whether it was with a text at midnight, a warm coffee waiting for her in the morning, or an impromptu trip to the park when he sensed she needed a break from the world. His presence was a comforting constant, a steady rhythm in her life when everything else felt chaotic. One evening, as they walked home after a late dinner, the streets were quiet, bathed in the gentle glow of streetlights. The world around them felt serene, almost magical, and the silence between them was companionable, filled with an understanding that words didn't need to disrupt. But tonight, there was something different in the air. YN noticed that Jungkook seemed unusually quiet, his gaze often fixed ahead as if he were deep in thought. She nudged him gently. You okay? You seem distracted. He looked down, a shy smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yeah, just thinking. They continued walking in silence, and YN felt a strange flutter in her chest. She didn't want to pry, but curiosity got the better of her. Thinking about what? Jungkook stopped walking, and she turned to face him, surprised by the intensity in his gaze. His eyes held a quiet determination, a sincerity that made her heart skip a beat. YN, he began, his voice soft yet unshakable. I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how you'll take it, but it's been on my mind for a while now. A shiver ran through her as he took a hesitant step closer, his hand reaching out as if to take hers, then stopping just inches away. He clenched his fist instead, as if steadying himself. Jungkook, what is it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked down, taking a deep breath before meeting her gaze again. I care about you, YN. I care about you in a way it's different from just being friends. He paused, the words hanging in the air between them, heavy with meaning. More than I probably should. Her heart pounded as his words sank in, her mind racing to process what he'd just said. She felt her cheeks warm, her breath catching in her throat. She'd known that their friendship was special, that he meant more to her than she'd wanted to admit, but she hadn't expected this, hadn't dared to hope that his feelings might be the same. But, Jungkook, she started, feeling a mixture of excitement and confusion in her chest. I'm still with Taehyung. I don't know if I'm ready for this. Jungkook nodded, his gaze unwavering. I know, YN. I know things with Taehyung are complicated, and the last thing I want is to make things harder for you. But I couldn't keep pretending anymore. She bit her lip, looking away, trying to gather her thoughts. Taehyung's name felt heavy on her tongue, a reminder of the history they shared, of the tangled mess of feelings she still couldn't quite unravel. But when she thought about Jungkook, standing there with his eyes filled with nothing but sincerity, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Jungkook, you've been there for me in ways that I can't even explain, she murmured, meeting his gaze again. But I'm just not sure I can give you what you deserve. Not right now. His expression softened, a gentle smile curving his lips. I get it, YN. I really do, and I don't want you to feel pressured or rushed. I just need you to know how I feel. He reached out again, this time letting his fingers graze her hand, his touch light but reassuring. I'll wait, he said softly. I'll wait as long as it takes. I don't expect anything from you, and I don't want to add to the weight you're already carrying. I just wanted you to know that you have someone who sees you, who'll be here no matter what. YN felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, a mix of gratitude and guilt swirling within her. She squeezed his hand, her voice unsteady as she replied, "Thank you, Jungkook. I don't know if I deserve someone like you, but thank you." They stood there, under the soft glow of the streetlights, his hand holding hers, a silent promise in his touch. She realized that, with Jungkook, she didn't need to pretend, didn't need to force herself into someone else's expectations. His patience, his quiet strength, and his willingness to wait gave her a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in a long time. As they resumed their walk, a new kind of silence settled between them, not the silence of uncertainty or tension, but one of understanding, of possibility. They walked side by side, a gentle smile on his face as he guided her safely through the night, each step bringing them closer to a future that neither of them could fully see but both felt drawn toward. And as they neared her building, YN found herself glancing at Jungkook, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She wasn't ready yet, but she knew that, one day, when she was, he'd be there, waiting patiently, with that same steady, unshakable love he'd shown her all along. The evening felt heavier than usual, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on YN's chest. Her phone buzzed, and she stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the call button. For so long, she had kept quiet, waiting, hoping that things would change. But tonight, after the constant neglect and unkept promises, she couldn't hold back any longer. With a deep breath, she dialed Taehyung's number. The phone rang, each second stretching longer in the silence until he finally picked up. YN. His voice sounded distant, distracted, as if he wasn't fully present, as usual. Taehyung, do you even care? YN's voice trembled, a mixture of frustration and hurt bubbling to the surface. The words felt like a weight lifted off her chest, but they also felt foreign. She hadn't allowed herself to voice her true feelings in so long. You promised you'd be there, and once again, you didn't show. There was a brief pause before he responded, his tone less apologetic and more annoyed. YN, it's just one night. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? YN clenched her jaw, trying to keep the anger from spilling over. It's not just one night. It's every night, every time. It's the way you make me feel like I'm not even part of your life. Her words hit like a sharp sting, and she felt a small, bitter tear slip down her cheek. The hurt had been building for months, but now it felt like it was finally crashing over her in waves. Look, I don't have time for this. Taehyung's voice grew colder, almost impatient. I told you, I have my own things going on. You knew what you were getting into. The finality in his voice made her heart twist. She had always tried to understand him, to make excuses for his behavior, but now she could no longer pretend. No, Taehyung, she said, her voice unwavering, though her hands were shaking. I didn't know it would feel like this. Like I'm invisible to you. You promised me things would be different, but they never are. You keep making me feel like I'm not a priority. The silence that followed felt suffocating. YN could almost hear him thinking, weighing his words, deciding whether or not to fight for them. But when he spoke again, it wasn't with the reassurance she needed. YN, if you can't handle my schedule, maybe this isn't going to work, Taehyung muttered, his words cutting deeper than any harsh argument. The finality of his statement hit her like a punch to the gut. Her breath caught, the reality of it all sinking in. She had been clinging to hope, but this was the truth. The truth that he no longer cared, that he had made his choice, and that she was simply not enough for him. Her chest tightened with a pang of betrayal. Her heart was breaking, but at the same time, she felt something else. Something unfamiliar, but welcome, relief. She was finally free from the constant cycle of waiting, of wondering if he would show up, if he would care enough to put in the effort. Taking a shaky breath, YN steadied herself, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. Fine, I hope you're happy, Taehyung. She didn't wait for his response, and didn't need to hear any more empty words. She ended the call with a tap, the finality of the action almost soothing. YN dropped her phone onto the couch, her hands trembling as she let out a shaky breath. She could feel the weight of the situation lifting off her shoulders, but the ache in her chest remained, bittersweet and lingering. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at the phone, trying to process everything. This chapter with Taehyung was officially over. She couldn't keep holding on to something that wasn't meant to be. A part of her wanted to scream, to cry out for the love that never fully existed between them, but another part of her knew this was the end. As she sat in the silence, YN felt the strangest mix of sadness and freedom. The pain was there, deep and raw, but underneath it all, she felt something else, something hopeful, something new. She had been waiting for Taehyung to see her, to care about her, but now she knew she had to be the one to see herself. With a deep, steadying breath, she finally stood up. She was done with waiting. Done with being the one who always gave more. And as the tears fell quietly down her cheeks, YN whispered to herself, I deserve better. A few weeks had passed since YN had ended things with Taehyung, and while the healing was still ongoing, she felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had begun to rediscover who she was outside of the toxic relationship. And the more time she spent with Jungkook, the more she realized how much she had been missing. His kindness, his unwavering support, and his ability to just make her laugh, even when she was feeling down, felt like a breath of fresh air. It was an ordinary afternoon on campus, the sun high in the sky and the chatter of students filling the air. YN and Jungkook were walking side by side, sharing an inside joke that had them both laughing. For the first time in what felt like forever, YN wasn't haunted by the past. She could see a future, a bright one, where she wasn't constantly second-guessing her worth. But just as the moment seemed perfect, everything shifted. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a familiar figure standing by a tree, his gaze fixed on them. Taehyung. The sight of him made her stomach tighten, but she refused to let it ruin her moment with Jungkook. As they continued walking, YN didn't think Taehyung would approach, but his voice, sharp and full of possessiveness, cut through the air like a knife. Back off, Jungkook, Taehyung spat, stepping into their path, his eyes narrowed with jealousy. His tone was defensive, angry even, as if he was trying to stake a claim that no longer existed. Jungkook stopped, his face hardening, but he didn't flinch. He stood tall, his gaze unwavering, and YN could see the calm determination in his eyes as he replied, his voice cool but firm, she's not yours, Taehyung. She's never been yours. She deserves to be with someone who actually cares. The words stung, not just for Taehyung, but for YN as well. The realization hit her all over again, how much time she had wasted on someone who couldn't even see her worth. And now here was Taehyung, trying to exert control once more, as if nothing had changed, as if he still had a claim to her heart. Taehyung's eyes flicked between the two of them, his expression flickering with a brief flash of hurt before it hardened again into something darker, more possessive. You think you can just take her from me? He growled, his tone low and dangerous. She was mine, Jungkook. And if you think she's going to forget about me that easily, you're wrong. YN's heart hammered in her chest, her breath catching as she took a step forward. She had spent too long letting Taehyung's actions dictate her emotions, and she wasn't going to let him do it any longer. She wasn't the same person who had been manipulated by his neglect and empty promises. No, she said, her voice steady, but filled with conviction. Taehyung, we're over. You didn't care enough when you had the chance, and I'm done waiting for you to realize my worth. I'm done letting you make me feel small. Taehyung's face contorted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. For a moment, he seemed to want to argue, to make her doubt herself, but she stood her ground. This was her moment to reclaim her power, to let go of the lingering shadows of the past. He opened his mouth to say something, but stopped himself, as if the words were failing him. Instead, his face shifted from fury to something darker, more hurt than YN had expected. For the briefest moment, there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a glimpse of the boy who had once claimed to love her. But it quickly vanished, replaced by an angry mask. This isn't over, Taehyung muttered, his voice low and thick with bitterness, his jaw clenched. He turned away sharply, walking past them with his shoulders stiff, his steps heavy and deliberate. YN stood there for a moment, watching him go, her heart still thumping in her chest. She couldn't deny that a part of her still hurt from what they had once been. But now, it felt like a distant ache. She had made her peace with it, and she was finally free from the weight of Taehyung's possessiveness. As Taehyung disappeared into the distance, YN exhaled, the tension leaving her body. She looked at Jungkook, who had been standing by her side the whole time, his eyes soft with understanding. You're really something, you know that. Jungkook said, his voice gentle as he placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her the support she had always longed for but never received. YN smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting in a way that felt more genuine than it had in a long time. Yeah, I am. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a new sense of clarity. And I'm not going to let anyone make me feel like I'm not worth it anymore. Jungkook's lips quirked upward, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade into the background. It was just the two of them now, standing side by side, no longer bound by the past, ready to face whatever came next. As they walked off together, their laughter ringing through the air, YN realized that this was the beginning of something new, something real. And she wasn't going to let anything or anyone take that away from her again. The evening had fallen soft and quiet, the air crisp with the coolness of late autumn. YN and Jungkook had just left the small cafe on the corner of the street where they'd shared a late dinner. The night was still, the only sound of the crunch of leaves underfoot as they walked side by side, the warmth of their laughter lingering in the cool air. YN glanced over at Jungkook, her heart fluttering. In the few months they'd spent together, he had become more than just a comfort. He had become her constant, her anchor in a world that had felt so uncertain before. His presence was soothing, yet exhilarating, and every moment spent with him seemed to weave their connection even tighter. Jungkook turned to her, his eyes soft, his expression a mix of fondness and something deeper, something more intense. He slowed his pace as they reached a quiet park bench under the dim glow of a street lamp. Hey, Jungkook said, his voice low and gentle, drawing her attention. YN stopped beside the bench and turned to him, their faces just inches apart now. What is it? He smiled, though there was a hint of hesitation in his eyes. I've been thinking, I never really got to say how much you mean to me. I know it's been a lot for both of us to go through, but I can't help but feel like every moment I spend with you, it's just right. It feels like I've been waiting for this, for you, without even realizing it. YN felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart thudding louder with each passing second. She had never heard him speak so openly, and the sincerity in his voice took her by surprise. You don't have to say anything, YN, he continued, stepping a little closer, his hand brushing against hers in a soft, tentative touch. I just want you to know that I care for you, deeply. And I want to be with you, in every sense. No more doubts, no more second guessing. Just, us. The words settled between them, and YN felt a rush of warmth fill her chest, mixed with a sense of vulnerability. She had never been this open with anyone, but with Jungkook, it felt different. It felt like a natural progression of everything they had been through together, each moment, each step, leading them to this point. She took a deep breath, her fingers slowly curling into his, drawing him closer. Jungkook, her voice faltered for a moment as her heart raced. I've been so scared, for so long. Scared of getting hurt, scared of opening up. But with you, she looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with an honesty that surprised even herself. With you, I don't feel that way anymore. I feel like I can finally let go of everything holding me back. Jungkook's gaze softened, and without another word, he closed the distance between them. His hand slid gently to her cheek, cupping her face as he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers with a tenderness that stole the breath from her lungs. The kiss was slow at first, like an unspoken promise, a quiet declaration of everything they had both been holding inside. It deepened, though, as the world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in that one stolen moment. The warmth of his touch, the feeling of his lips against hers, felt like everything YN had ever needed, everything she had been searching for. Jungkook pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the cold night air. I'll never stop showing you how much you mean to me, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. YN closed her eyes, her hand reaching up to trace the lines of his jaw. And I'll never stop trusting you. For a long moment, they stood there in the quiet park, their hearts beating in sync. YN's hand slid down to rest against his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her fingers, a reassurance that he was real, that this was real. I don't want to let you go, YN murmured, her voice barely audible in the night. Jungkook's arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer. You don't have to. I'm not going anywhere. The world around them seemed to disappear entirely in that moment. There was no past with Taehyung, no uncertainty about the future. There was only the here and now. Jungkook's arms around her, his lips on her forehead, the warmth of his body pressed against hers. It felt like they had finally found their place, their time, and nothing else mattered. The silence between them wasn't empty, It was filled with unspoken words, promises that didn't need to be said out loud. They had both found their way to each other, and this was just the beginning of the new chapter in their story.